All I do is grow, grow, grow no matter what. Got growth on my mind, I could never give up. And every time I get that sinking
welcome
feeling,
to another
that
math
makes me
lesson with
feel
Miss
stuck.
J.
That's me. And today we're talking about rounding decimal numbers. In the background, you might see a race that's getting ready to begin. This race took place in the beautiful city of Memphis, Tennessee, and it's one of my friends from my hometown in Orlando, Florida. His name's Marvin Bracy. He's a former Olympic participant, 2016 participant, and also professional athlete. Let's check and see how he did in this race. Let's take a look.
So watch the start for Marvin Bracy in lane number 4. Green was out of the block strongly in lane 2, but here comes Bracy. Surging through the line. No one's going to catch him right around that 10-second barrier as we wait for the official time. And it's 9:85. Marvin Bracy, he loves it. Matching his career best in a one.
So if we take a look at Marvin Bracy's time, you'll see that these decimal numbers, he came in first. This was a race here in Memphis, beautiful Memphis, Tennessee, just a few weeks ago. He came in first place, but you'll see those decimal numbers up there, those numbers in standard form, but they have decimals. His time was 9 and 85 hundredths. Now, if they were to round his decimal number incorrectly, he could possibly not be ranked in the proper ranking. So we're going to look at why the place value of each digit is so important when we round decimal numbers. So let's go ahead and begin. Again, shout out to Marvin. Let's go ahead and begin our lesson. First thing I want to look at here is we have some numbers on my place value chart, okay? And our first task, they want us to round this number to the nearest tens. When I'm thinking about rounding, I want to think about place value of the number. Place value of the number, okay? And what that means is, in order for me to round to the nearest tens, I need to find out how many total tens I have in this number, okay? Now, in my first place value here, I have 100, 100, so there's a 100 block, as you can see, okay? And it's noted that way, you might remember from 4th grade, because there are 100 pieces here, 100 total pieces. That's why we call this a 100 block, okay? Now, in the tens place value, I have a block that has, if you can see, 10 total pieces. That's why we call it the tens block, okay? And in my ones place value, I have 5 ones. So I have 100, 5 tens, and 5 ones, exactly as represented on my place value chart at the top. Now, in order for me to successfully round this number to the tens place, I have to decompose. And really, if we look at the definition for decompose, it means to separate into composites or basic elements. So the basic elements of each number is always the place value. So I'm going to separate, because I want to round to the nearest 10, I'm going to see how many total tens I have in this number. Well, I know I have 5 here, but I also know that I can take my 100 and I can trade it in. I can trade it in for 10 more tens. And how do I know that that works? Well, if I take a look here quickly, my 100, if I take 10 tens and line them up, you'll see that 10 tens gives me exactly one whole, okay? 100. So I'm going to take my 100 block and I'm going to trade it in for 10 tens. So now, instead of just having 5 tens in my number, when I decompose or break apart this number and find the total tens, I realize that instead of just having 5 tens, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 tens. So on my place value chart, just above, just up here, you'll probably see that there's 15 tens there. That means I decompose to find the total number of tens. So there's 15 tens and now 5 ones. Now that I have my total number of tens, I'm ready to go ahead and round this number. So let's round this number together, okay? So in order to set up this example, we're going to round using our place value chart, a vertical number line. I'm first starting by, just so we understand what's happening here, I'm placing, and this number, when I decomposed it, well, when I started, I had 1 in the hundreds place, 5 in the tens, and 5 ones. But when I decomposed it, I ended up with 15 tens, which is the same thing as 150, and 5 ones. So let's take that information and put it on a vertical number line. Okay? So if I'm rounding 155, the number 155, to the nearest tens, which is what they asked me, I'm first going to underline the place value. And the reason I know this is a tens place, because on my place value chart, I'm looking and I recognize that the second digit in my number, the second digit, okay? Can you all see that? The first digit is the ones place. The second digit is the tens, okay? So I'm underlining the place value. That's my first step. Now, I'm going to set up, every time I work on the vertical number line to round, when we're rounding, they're asking basically, is my number closer to the lower endpoint or the next endpoint? Okay? And here's what I mean by that. When you set up your vertical number line, you want to have a lower endpoint. That lower endpoint is your total number of the unit you're rounding to. So I'm rounding to the tens place. I know that I have 15 tens, right? I have 15 total tens. And I know that that number, 15 tens, is the same thing as 150 in standard form, okay? If I skip count it, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, that's 10, 120, 10, 120, 130, 140, 150. That gives me 150. So when I'm rounding, I start, my lower endpoint is always the actual number of the place value I have. And then my next step is just to add one more. So if I had 15 tens to begin with, I'm going to add one more 10. That gives me 16 tens. And that number is the same thing as 160. So now I have my two endpoints. Now my next step is I need to find the midpoint. What's the halfway point between those, okay? So if I'm thinking about this, if I count from 150 all the way up to 160, I know that right in the middle is 155. And so my midpoint, the middle, that's not exactly the middle, let's make that the middle. The middle would be 15 tens and 5 ones, giving me 155, okay? Now that I have those numbers, I'm asking myself, where does my number fall on this number line? The number that I began with is 155. So where can I find that on my number line? Is it below the midpoint? Is it down here? Or is it above the midpoint? Is it up here? Well, as I look, I can see that 155 is actually right at the midpoint. So I'm going to draw a star, to show where my number is. Okay? We have a star there. I tried my best. Okay. Now that we have our star, we can see that our number is right here at the midpoint. When your number is right at the midpoint and you're rounding, okay, if your number is at the midpoint or above the midpoint, when we round it up to the next number. So 155 tens, 155 rounded to the nearest 10 is the same thing as 160, because if we're rounding to the nearest tens, the next 10 is 16 tens or 160. So if I'm rounding to the nearest tens, my answer would be 160. And so this little squiggly line tells me that I'm rounding. That is, it's an approximate answer. It's not the exact answer. Okay, let's try another one. We're going to try another one here. going to clear my whiteboard. And let's round another one. Now let's try to do the same thing with decimal numbers, okay? Try to do the same thing with decimal numbers, okay? So here we go. This time I would like to round this number. The number is 1 and 5700. So on my place value chart, I'm going to put a 1 in the ones place. And I notice right next to the ones place is always the decimal. Then I have 5/10 and 7/100, okay? So if I'm rounding this one to the nearest tenths, okay, I'm going to decompose to see how many total tenths I have, and then I'm going to set up my number line. So let's do that together. So I know that my tenths place is right next to the decimal. That's going to be very, very important. So let's take a look together really quickly. So I'm going to write my decimal number at the top again, 1 and 5700ths, and the place value they want me to round to is the tenths place. So I'm underlining the place value they want me to round to, that is the tenths place. So I know when I'm decomposing, I need to look at, I have 5/10 here, but how many tenths do I have in one whole? Now if you remember, one whole, in order for us to have a whole, it takes 10/10 to make up a whole. So when we're looking at decimal numbers, this block becomes the whole, and these become the tenths. So how many of these does it take to fill up to get one whole? It takes 10 of these. So I know that one whole has 10 tenths. I'm just showing you here. One whole takes 10 tenths, 10 of these to make one whole. So I'm going to decompose my decimal number again. So here we go. I'm setting it up. I have my vertical number line. Vertical just means up and down. My first step is always to have my lower end point and upper end point. So my lower end point, if I'm looking at my number here, I know that I will have one whole, that's 10/10 plus 5 more tenths, that's 15 total tenths. 15/10 is the same thing. I would write that decimal number as 1.5. Okay. My next step is I got to go up one place value, 1/10. Going to add one more tenth to get my upper end point. So if I have 15/10 as a lower end point, I now need to make the next upper end point 16/10. And that's written as a decimal number. Notice these are tenths, not tens. And because they are tenths, on the way I write this number in standard form, we'll have a decimal. Because they are tenths. That's why place value is so important. I'm trying to zoom in here quickly so you can see. So place value is really, really important. Really, really important. Okay. So you notice if it's tenths, I have a decimal in between that number. Okay. All right, let's continue working. So let's continue rounding. So I have my lower end point, my upper end point. And what I like to do before I do anything else is I like to make sure I see that in my original number, I have 1, 2, 3 digits. Each number is a digit. So in order for me to quickly find the midpoint, I like to make sure that my upper points and my lower points have the same number of digits. So I'm just going to add a 0 because that does not make the number any bigger or any smaller. So now it might be very easy for me to find my midpoint, okay? If I'm counting, okay, from 1 and 5/10 up to 1 and 6/10, I know that this will be 1 and 51/10, 1 and 52, 1 and 51, 1 and 52, 1 and 53, 1 and 54, and my midpoint would be 1 and 55/100. I could write that by saying that's 15/10 and 5/100. And that decimal number, the way I would write that decimal number would be 1 and 55/100. So now I know that my midpoint here is 1 and 55/100. My next step is, well, where is this number on the number line? Is it below the midpoint or is it above? Well, if I'm counting, I know that, again, if I'm comparing the numbers like we did last week, I know that 1 and 57/100 would be greater than, so I'm going to put it right here, greater than, just going to put a little diamond there to show. 1 and 57/100 is definitely greater than 1 and 55/100 if I compare my place values. So it would go above, okay? So now looking at this, the last question I always ask is my number on the number line closer to 16/10, which is 1 and 6/10, or is it closer to 15/10? Well, I can clearly see that this number is actually closer. If I had to count, there would be only a few more jumps, 1, 2, 3, to get there, okay? So when I'm rounding, 1 and 57/100 rounded to the nearest tenths is approximately 1.60, okay? 1 and 6/10. So that's how we would round that one, okay? And so now what I'd like to do is I want us to put together basically all that we've learned here, okay? We're going to put together everything we've learned. And this is how we're going to do it. I am going to, let's just round another number. This time you're going to see the numbers change here quickly, and you can just kind of see the steps, and let's just walk through them together. Hopefully this will be helpful. So let's take a look. First thing, let's take a look. First step I would do is always go ahead and put my number on my place value chart. So let's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and put the 2 in the ones place, the 3 in the tenths, and the 8 in the hundreds. So that's the first step. We're making sure that those numbers are in the correct place value. And we're rounding to the nearest hundred, so I've highlighted the place value that I'm rounding to. On my whiteboard, I might underline the 3 because I know, excuse me, I keep saying the hundreds. It's actually the tenths. Apologize. The tenths place, okay? We're rounding to the nearest tenths place. And because we're rounding to the nearest tenths place, I'm going to underline the 3 in the tenths place. Now that I have that, let's figure out how many total tenths we have. So in this example, we have 2 ones, 3 tenths, and 8 hundredths. So I know that if I have 1 1, if we remember correctly, 1 1 gives me 10 tenths, and another one gives me another 10 tenths. So this is 10 tenths plus 10 tenths. So this will give me 20 tenths plus the 3 tenths I have in a tenths place. That gives me 23 tenths. And I would write that decimal number as 2 and 3 tenths. Now I'm going to go ahead and increase to find my upper limit. I'm going to increase it by 1/10, and that looks like 2 and 4 tenths. 2 and 4 tenths. Now that I have that, finding my midpoint, and remember our midpoint, the way we would find it, if we put those placeholders like we showed in the examples and we had the same number of digits, this would be 2, at the end point would be 2 and 3 tenths or 2 and 30 hundredths, and the upper limit would be 2 and 4 tenths or 2 and 40 hundredths. And if I count it up, I can easily see that 2 and 35 hundredths is my midpoint for this example. Now I have to put my number on the number line. My original number, as you can see, up there somewhere, that way, it's up there, y'all. It's 2 and 38 hundredths. Let's go ahead and put that on the number line. If you said that that number was above the midpoint, you're correct, because if I compare the place values, I see there's a 2 in the ones place, a 2 in the ones place. Those are equal. A 3 in the tens place, a 3 in the tens place. Those are equal. But if I look at the hundreds place, I see that the 8 in the hundreds place is larger. So I'm going to put it above that 5 in the hundreds place. And it goes right above that spot on the number line. I'm going to put a star there. And then if I'm rounding, I'm asking myself, is 2 and 3800ths closer to my upper limit or my lower limit or endpoint? And I can see that 2 and 3800ths is much closer to 2 and 4/10. So I would round to 2 and 4/10. Okay. So I hope that that example was helpful. You can play it back, take a look at those steps. And one thing I just want to point out and remind everybody, you know, I love playing Connect 4. It's one of my favorite games, but I make mistakes when I play that. Your scholar or you might make mistakes as you're working on this skill, but mistakes are really, really valuable, and they really help us. They really help us to actually, it helps our brains as we make those mistakes to make new connections and to learn the math. So don't be afraid of the mistakes. I always say to scholars, you know, let's just learn from mistakes because your brain is actually growing when you're making those mistakes. I hope this video was helpful. I look forward to another math video with you all. Be gracious and kind to one another. I'm out.